Hi, good morning. It's good to be with everybody. And it's snowing at my house, so I just think spring weather is so crazy. Glad we could get together virtually today. So a little bit about me. I work at the State Board of Education and I'm our Student and Family Rights Coordinator. So I do a lot of work with our family engagement work, our youth in custody, education services, and then I do a lot of work with students with disabilities. And I'm often the person who parents speak with when they call the board with concerns, as well as the agency. If school districts or charters call with questions about special ed law, I'm often the one who gets to speak with them. So we offer a number of kind of services to help families work through disagreements and to look into concerns families have about schools following the law. And so this is kind of work I've been doing for the past 10 years, and I'm passionate about it. And I love kind of that intersection of disability and civil rights and education. So I'm happy to be with you today. This is a topic that I had not looked into very much until Audra reached out to me earlier, and even it was last fall to kind of plan for this conference. And so I definitely still have a lot to learn. I am not an expert because this is not something I get calls a lot about. But what I hope today is to share some basic concepts of what students with disabilities are entitled to and kind of the educational realm, and some connections I see to the work that you do. But anything that you think is relevant to share, please pop it into the chat or ask a question through the Q&A, because I definitely learn from you, and it helps me to kind of, the last session, things that people asked helped me to kind of say, okay, we need to focus a little bit on this the next time around. So I'm going to share a presentation. And so let me jump into getting my screen share here. Okay, I'm gonna get out of that guy. Okay, so what I wanted to start with is, sorry, I'm just making sure I can see everything here. What I wanted to start with is this quote from the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this comes from the preamble, or kind of the beginning of the act. It says, disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. Improving educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. I like to start with this quote, and because I think it kind of helps frame where I want to go today. And I can see a lot of intersections with driver education and kind of that path to getting a driver's license, that path to having more independence. A big push in creating these laws for students with disabilities was that prior to these civil rights laws that came about in the 70s and the 80s, the lives of folks with disabilities were often had some big barriers and challenges. There's still a high poverty rate among adults with disabilities. There are still many folks with disabilities who are kind of isolated from their community and from society. And that's directly connected to their opportunity to get jobs, and jobs that pay well, and jobs that are integrated, meaning jobs where they work with people without disabilities. And so although I think we're looking at a range of folks, and not every person with a disability will necessarily have the ability to drive, that I think it's really important for us to remember how key this program alone is to bringing about some of these things for some of our students. And I think what I've learned in the past 10 years is that a lot of the work we do toward accommodating folks with disabilities is about problem solving. It's about getting rid of some of those implicit biases that we may have about what students with disabilities are capable of. And I think we can overcome a lot as we work together as a team, as we bring in folks who have expertise and as we work with families, because sometimes the biggest barrier is our mindset about what kids are capable of and kind of not thinking through how we could support and help them. So we go to this next slide, and what I wanted to touch on is there are a few different laws that impact students with disabilities. And I've got a graphic in the next slide to kind of give a bigger picture of that. But Section 504 was a law that was passed in the 70s, and it is often paired with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And these are civil rights laws, so their goal is to prevent public programs and kind of public agencies from discriminating against folks on the basis of a disability. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act has a little bit different slant. It's definitely geared toward supporting students with disabilities, but it is an education opportunity law. So it came with funding. It comes with a lot more regulations and kind of a lot more procedural components. So some of the kids you have may have a Section 504 plan, and those are often less built out and less regulated. They will often include some accommodations that we're going to talk about, where the IDEA grants students who qualify under that with an IEP or an individualized education program. And that's going to spell out a lot more than what you'll usually see in a Section 504 plan. But I think the helpful thing is to kind of, this is just one graphic. There's a lot of graphics out there that kind of illustrate this. But I think what's important to remember is the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to all individuals with disabilities. It's not something that you have a plan for. It's more this idea that folks with disabilities can request accommodations if they need those in a lot of different areas. A Section 504 plan is something you're going to see in a school, and that is a student who has a disability who needs some accommodations. But when you get to the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, as you can kind of see, that is very student focused, and it pulls in a need that a student may have for special education services. So that's kind of a key distinction between 504 versus IDEA, is that students who qualify under the IDEA, it is shown that they need a special education plan, that the way that we provide instruction is modified and adapted and changed for them, versus a 504 plan where we may not change the instruction very much, but we're offering some accommodations. And I'm going to talk about some examples of accommodations as we get a little bit further in. So just some basics, again, remembering that these two broader laws prohibit discrimination on the basis of a disability. And so it's this idea about equal access and fairness, and that is a more general type thing. When you think about, what does discrimination look like? I mean, discrimination is when you treat someone differently because of their disability. Maybe that they are, and because of that, they are not able to participate fully. They're not able to access different opportunities. And so removing some of those barriers by providing accommodations. But what the law typically how it describes it is it's a reasonable accommodation. We're going to talk about that because we had some questions in the last session, so I want to make it a little bit more clear. But some accommodations that kids may often get in the classroom, and I know many of you are teachers, so you're probably familiar with this, preferential seating, extended time to finish assignments, maybe taking a test in a quiet area, maybe some competency-based type stuff. So you may shorten an assignment, but not because you're making it easier. You're still able to kind of get the student to perform at the same, like demonstrate the same content knowledge, but you recognize like this assignment's pretty long and I could take out some of these questions and I would still be able to have the student demonstrate what they know. A lot of our students with 504 plans often are students with attention and mild learning difficulties. So a lot of kiddos with ADHD or mild dyslexia, some of these mild learning disabilities, where they just may need some of those extra accommodations in order to make progress. Another example might be a student who has some issues with like fine motor control. So cognitively they're fine, they're able to keep up in that way, but maybe writing is not their thing. They struggle with legible penmanship that you can read. And so sometimes making accommodations in terms of speech to text, or kiddos who are a little bit slower readers who benefit from text to speech. They can listen to things being read aloud and they can keep up in terms of content and comprehend it, but they're slower readers. And so that's one way that they can kind of access assignments and tests and even written text in class in a more, just a more beneficial way for them. The thing to keep in mind, and I think this is really important in the context in which you work, is that the law, it has you provide reasonable accommodations, but you can't make fundamental alterations. And so there are times where a family or an individual may ask for some type of accommodation that just so much changes the program that you can't grant that. That's not something that's entitled to under the law. And I think as I thought through the driver education process, definitely with some of the medical health and the physical fitness elements of that, you can't make accommodations to some of those things because it would result in safety concerns for the individual and others that they may encounter in the driving experience. So I think it's important to know that sometimes an accommodation will not be granted because it's not reasonable and it would constitute a fundamental alteration of the program. And what I'd encourage you to do, which I think Audra did a great job of reminding folks at the end of last time's presentation, is if you have a family or a student requesting some of these accommodations, work closely with your administrators, work closely with your special education folks, and they can help you, because this is an issue that is subject to review from the Department of Ed Office for Civil Rights if someone were to file a complaint. And you are required as districts or charters to have somebody who is designated as an ADA coordinator. And so whoever that is within your district or charter, that person can kind of help you navigate these requests. And if you choose to decline a specific request, then you would want to make sure you have good documentation of your communication back and forth over email or letters or whatnot, and that you're making sure you consult with someone who has some good background knowledge about that so they can help you work through these decisions. It's important to let families and students know that these protections also need to be provided through state government agencies. And so there are elements of the driver education and kind of obtaining a driver's license process where those accommodations requests will need to be directed to the driver's license division because they're going to be the ones to make some decisions about the elements that they're in charge of. And when I reached out to them this month to kind of ask about that, they don't have any written information on their website. They don't have anything that I could necessarily refer to. What they told me is that you would contact the local office directly and make a request, and that they would review that. And it often does come through, giving some documentation, which we're going to talk about later, that they may ask for. So In terms of the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, I wanted to just highlight a couple things, and those are the things that are in bold. Like I said, this law gets a lot more kind of specific about requirements and things, but it's supposed to be grounded in having high expectations for our students, with that end goal of making sure that our students are able to lead productive and independent adult lives when they leave us. And so it's grounded in this meaningful opportunity to participate with peers, but this component of special education, related services, and aids and supports. Related services are things that help a student access and make progress in the gen ed environment. And those are often seen as things like counseling, speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, some of the different supports a student may need in addition to supports from their classroom teachers because of how their disability impacts them in the general ed setting. The law also focuses on assistive technology devices and services, and those are definitely come into play for students with disabilities in driver education, particularly if they're students with some physical disabilities that could benefit from adaptations with vehicles or tools and things that will allow them to still drive if they have access to those things. So you often hear the term IEP, that stands for Individualized Education Program, and a component of kind of this topical area for me is who makes up the team. The law says once a student is eligible, they have an IEP that's going to kind of outline their services and supports, and that is developed by a team. And the law kind of outlines who is required to be on that team, and then they have some optional folks that case law sometimes will say were required depending on what the team was developing for the student to access that free appropriate public education. So it's definitely includes the parents, it includes at least one general educator, at least one special educator, often, or it does require an LEA representative, and LEA just stands for Local Education Agency, which is a district or a charter. And this is often the vice principal or the principal, some type of administrator in the building. Folks who interpret the instructional implications of evaluation results. That's often the school psychologist because we're looking into things, but in the realm of students with disabilities and driving, that may include somebody in your district who knows about assistive technology. It could include someone from vocational rehabilitation if they're offering some supports and services to the student in terms of employment and what they may need there as we're working with older high school age students. You'll notice that when a student is 14 and older, they are required members of the team. That doesn't mean they always show up, but the team's required to involve them and invite them as much as possible. And then this last piece, the law says either the school or parents can invite anybody else who has knowledge or special expertise regarding the student. And this is something Audra and I talked about in the past, is this could be a driver education teacher. I wouldn't say in every instance. I know that it's often tricky to get folks to some of these meetings, but what I would say is in some instances, I think it would be really appropriate to participate in that meeting. And regardless of whether you're able to be at the meeting or not, there should be planning that kind of goes into the meeting ahead of time, and that would be a great piece for the special ed teacher who's kind of often coordinating the meeting and the plan development to connect with a driver education teacher. School counselors are also another one that are sometimes pulled in and kind of connect to this as well. And so what I would say is you can be part of the meeting through being there in person, but you can also be part of the process through getting involved before, during, and after this IEP is created. The team is required to do this at least annually. For some kids, we end up meeting more frequently than that. So when you develop an IEP, there are different parts, different components that kind of apply to this. And I think as you think about kind of the different components of the driver education and getting a driver's license, kind of different things play into that too. So every student's IEP has goals. It has services that are connected to the goals. It has accommodations. There is a section where the team talks about how the student's going to participate in statewide and district testing. And I think that's a nice connection to some of the work you're involved in, because we talk about accommodations that kids may get for tests. And I've mentioned some examples of those. And I think it's important to know, and this is outlined in the driver's ed handbook, and I've got a slide to touch on it later, but the question comes up some, so I'm just gonna talk about it now. If a student needs accommodations for that written test component, then they need to take that at the driver's license division rather than at the school. The driver's license division says we need to be the ones kind of making decisions about those accommodations. That said, I think it's helpful to kind of know what a student has received before and what is helpful for them, so that the parent and the student can kind of advocate and be familiar with what's been helpful when they're communicating with the driver's license division. Again, communication supports, behavior supports, assistive technology, depending on the students, we may have some different needs there. What I wanted to point out is that when you think about students with disabilities in the school setting, there's a few things to keep in mind. And I may be preaching to the choir because some of you may have a lot of experience working with kids with disabilities, but I wasn't sure. So I wanted to just paint a little bit of a picture. We often see folks who have those physical or visible disabilities, and that is definitely a portion of our students. But a bigger portion of our students in public schools are students with what we call hidden disabilities. About 60% of all of our kids with IEPs, they qualify for an IEP because of learning disabilities and learning difficulties. And those can range from more mild to moderate to severe. And so again, as you kind of think about the student population that could be reasonably accommodated to go through this process, many kids with mild and moderate learning disabilities can obtain a driver's license, but I think some of those students will need some of those supports. And so I think it's key. Many times by the time you have kids in high school, they have been identified and found eligible for services, but there are some times, especially kind of through the puberty and teenage processes, that things become apparent that maybe weren't apparent before, or as work gets more rigorous and difficult, some of these learning disabilities may surface that maybe kids were able to self-accommodate before. And so it's, again, if you're noticing struggles and a student doesn't have a plan, that's maybe a time to kind of connect with your student support team or your professional learning communities or whatever process you have in your school to kind of connect to teaming to say, I'm worried about this student, they seem to be struggling, can you let me know? And in some of those cases, and what I'm wondering, I think Audra brought this up in the last training too, you should know which students in your classes have an IEP and which students have a 504 plan, but sometimes that piece gets missed when we're talking about non-academic or extracurricular or elective type classes. And so I think it's key to make sure that where you are, that there is good communication among colleagues about which students in your classes have these plans and what the content of those plans, what the content is, so that you can actually make sure you're providing accommodations and you're aware of some of the supports a student may need as you're providing services to them. So an element that I wanted people to be aware of is that, as I mentioned earlier, for students 14 and older, they're to become a more involved player in the process. And that's because the IDEA has this portion of requirements to come into play for kids 14 and older called transition plan. And I know we use that term in different ways, kind of with different parts of the education system, but in the context of an IEP, a transition plan is an element of that that kind of outlines the students' post-secondary goals. And they're required to the team's required to look at goals in 3 big areas: post-secondary education and training, post-secondary employment, and post-secondary independent living. And traditionally, teams kind of focus on independent living for kids with pretty significant disabilities. I think sometimes they say, well, kids with more mild, like, we're not worried about them. They don't need as much goal development in those areas. But for me, driver education and getting that driver's license definitely connects to the independent living piece. And so as you can see, there's kind of different elements that come into play that may be applicable to the work that you're doing. That includes goals. It includes services that they may need. It includes some assessment. And so I think for some of our kids, we may be on the fence, like, is this an attainable goal or not? And I think that's where it's key to have meetings and to look at data and information, to talk to the student, to talk to the family, and kind of get a sense of where they're at and do they need supports? Do they need encouragement to participate in this process? So I wanted you to be aware that that's a great connector to some of the work that may be going on, and kind of know that that's a part of a student's plan. Getting back to our kind of discussion about fundamental alteration, I wanted to kind of illustrate the difference between accommodations and modifications, in part because this is something that comes up with families a lot. And I think it's key to kind of be aware of this and be able to communicate this, in part because from my perspective, going through this process, especially with the driver's license division, they're not about modifications, and they don't have to provide modifications. Under the IDEA, we do need to provide those things in class, and a modification if a student needs it because of their disability. So there are some students that coming up, K through 12, they have had modifications within their plan, and those do change learning expectations. They do reduce task requirements, and it is a change to instruction or curriculum that alters the content or those expectations. So that's appropriate in different classes and things that students do. But as you kind of get into the realm of ADA and 504, for example, like with concurrent enrollment, you can't always make modifications to concurrent enrollment or some of these things, because that would change the expectation and that would change their ability to kind of maintain that consistency of rigor and earn that college credit. And so I think that families and teams need to understand this key difference, that an accommodation, how is that different? Well, it's not changing the expectation, it's not changing the requirements, but it is allowing the student to access kind of like those examples that I shared earlier. And so, okay, great. Audra's taking care of me in the chat box. So I think it's just key, because I think sometimes we see this as kids are getting ready to go to college or go on to different things, that some parents have been very used to this modification element. And part of transition planning with kids in high school is sometimes fading supports and having those tough conversations, which I think is just across the board with teenagers anyway. Like, how do we help you become more independent and function without as much support as you've been given in the past? So it's definitely balancing that tension with you're still entitled to some of these accommodations, but we don't want to over accommodate. And in this instance, we can't modify certain learning expectations. Those are set by the state. They need to be in place to go through that process. And so we've got to figure out a way, can we accommodate some of this, but we're not going to make those modifications. So I think a key part of this, you know, I told you some of the work that I do is with family engagement. And I think just like there's some great transition connections with this work that you're doing, as I dug into this, I can tell a lot of this also brings up those connections with parents, that you're speaking with them about, you know, potential personal vehicle modifications and expectations for their kids, and kind of this big element of, to earn your learner's permit, you've got to do all these hours of driving with an adult and things like that. And so I see this as kind of a really great connection point when we talk about family engagement. I stole this off of a website that was really focused on kind of helping parents of students with autism and students on the spectrum kind of gauge where their students at. And I think we've seen a big increase in kids on the spectrum, especially in Utah. I know we have higher numbers here than many other states. And I think this is not a comprehensive list of questions, but I think sometimes, especially many parents did not deal with individuals with disabilities or accommodations until they had their own child. And so this may be kind of their first time helping a child with a disability in this way. And so questions about helping them work with you to determine the student's readiness, where they're at, what they may need. I think these questions were helpful to me as well, in that kids can cognitively not be struggling, but functionally and behaviorally have some needs that may impact their abilities in this area and may need some accommodations or instruction to get there. And some of that has to do with emotional regulation and control, receiving constructive criticism and instruction, kind of that awareness of other folks, as well as kind of looking a little deeper into medical and behavioral conditions and medical interventions that may be needed to ensure safe driving. So great question. It looks like Audra's typing it in. Tracy asks, what if I doubt a student will be able to drive? Do I ask or wait to be approached by the parents? So I'm going to see what Audra says, because she's more expert in this area. But I'm a big believer in transparent communication. And I'm a believer in just approaching things. And as Audra said, every student has the right to try. I think sometimes these conversations can be tricky, especially if you're not used to having them. And something that I learned with early work in the field of disability is that we actually have a lot of students who reach high school who don't even know they have an IEP. They kind of have a sense that they're different. They may know that they get some different supports, but maybe nobody's actually had an open discussion with them about their disability. And so I push this a lot because I hate to have a kid graduate or move on to the next steps in life and not understand their disability and what they need in terms of accommodations, because once you leave high school, you don't have an IEP anymore. And when you fall under the ADA and 504, that requires you as the individual with disability to ask for accommodations. And that's a distinction from the IDEA and IEPs, where the burden is on the school to say, hey, this student has a need and we need to provide it. When a student's at college, training, job, they are the one who has to go to their employer and say, hey, I actually have a learning disability and here are a few accommodations that help me. And so I think it's really important, and kind of going to Audra's point, we want to give students an opportunity to try, because we don't want to give the impression that we're discriminating on the basis of a disability. And so one way to make sure that we're not discriminating and that we're really looking into that is having discussions together. And I think it's important to pull in colleagues, especially if you feel uncomfortable because you haven't done it a lot before. You're worried like what questions might come up. I might not be able to answer those. Have a group discussion about it. But I think it's better to be open and share honest opinions. You are an expert in your area, and so it's okay. I think the big thing is you want to rely on data and you want to make sure you're putting your heads together as a team to look at this. And that will help you kind of parse out, am I making assumptions, or do I have these biases, or am I really like, are we having data-driven conversations about kind of what the requirements and the responsibilities are, and do we have information about the student to show us whether they're capable of that? And if not, can we build up skill development, or is that not going to be a thing with the student? And so I think you're balancing that with what Audra says in the chat box too. Like, you don't want to put yourself in danger, so, or the student or the public. So that is why it's important to be honest and transparent. If you see limitations or skill deficiencies, like, we do need to talk about that. But I think the nice thing about this process is there are various players and various checks. And so it does seem fairly rigorous on the part of the driver's license division, that they're gonna look pretty deeply into things and make sure that we're assessing student readiness. So as I thought about kind of the different components, and I may even be missing things, because like I said, I'm not an expert, but I noticed there's this written test, there's a driver education course, depending, I mean, if a student's younger and high school age, that's a requirement, and then a driving skills test. And so in the school setting, you're often doing this driver education course. These other components you're working on, you're doing that training behind the wheel, you're doing range. And so I think, again, for different kids with different disabilities, it was kind of hard for me to put this together, because just so many kids have different needs, and there may be kids who have some physical disabilities but no cognitive. So the written test piece, they may be fine with, but they're going to need to learn those hand controls, and they're going to need to access some of that assistive technology, versus we may have kids who physically know disabilities that would impact their ability to drive, but they process more slowly. And the slow processing may or may not be a barrier, depending on, can we help them access that through the written test, but actually they have good reaction and response time on the road. Or some kids may be slow kind of across the board, and it's again going to be that medical evaluation or determination, as well as other folks coming to the table to say, do they react quickly enough? Are they able to kind of manage all those skills that you need to be able to drive the vehicle safely? So I think it's key. If you get a student, you get an IEP, you don't feel like it gives you the information you need, that's where it would be nice to intersect with the team again and say, hey, you know, let's talk about some accommodations we might need in this realm, some supports we might need, and we can add those to the IEP. And you can add that through either having a meeting or through making an amendment. And that could be helpful in kind of guiding you in providing things to the student. So I did reference this earlier, but this does come from the driver education manual. Just a note, any student needing accommodations on that knowledge test, they need to complete that with the driver's license division. And so schools should not provide a reader, an interpreter, or other accommodation. And that is a little different than some of the state testing that schools are used to doing, where they can provide those things within the certain requirements and according to the accommodations assessment manual. So just make sure that you adhere to that. I pulled out the core standards, just a snapshot of some of them, because I want to remind us that IEPs for students, they are supposed to be grounded in the core standards. And I think we often think through reading and math, those are some of the key goals that you'll often see students have, but a team could create goals connected to these standards as well. And I'm a big fan of standards because I think they give us kind of structure that as a team, we can kind of look at some of these and say, okay, knowing what we know about the student with a disability, are they going to need some special education, some additional instruction? That could be reteaching concepts after they've learned them. It could be pre-teaching concepts. And kind of the way that it works within the school environment is the special ed teacher and that department, they are the experts in how to modify curriculum, where gen ed teachers and kind of core teachers bring that knowledge about the core standards. And so I see that connection with the work you do too. If you're a driver education teacher, you probably know these core standards fairly well. You can connect with a special ed teacher if you need some support. Like if a student's not grasping the information, that's why the IEP would be key to say, okay, how are they grasping it in other classes? What are we doing differently to help them access and make progress in this instruction? And we perhaps need to be doing that in this setting too. Great, and I love Terry's point. She says IEP teams can help with assessing if a student can or is able to do driver education. Exactly, when I kind of pointed to that team members, Terry points out physical therapists, occupational therapists, psychologists, vision, and hearing people could all give input. And I think that's key to remember because sometimes when you look at the case law, one of the key flaws that schools make in the IEP process sometimes is leaving out people with expertise on these students who could help us evaluate and then plan. And so I think that definitely applies in this realm too. If you're saying, I don't know enough to kind of know, pull in some of these folks that Terry mentioned, of course, in an individualized way, but they may be able to communicate with you and the rest of the team to figure out how we can accommodate the student or whether this is a reasonable goal or program to work through. So I think that actually just tied into this next slide, work together as a team, consult with everyone. That's how we're going to be able to problem solve some of these situations. If a student needs assistive technology to participate in the elements that you are over as the school, we need to make sure that we provide those so that the student can participate in the course. We also need to help facilitate communication if we're working with any contracted driver education programs to make sure that they're accommodating. There is some case law across the US where schools kind of worked with contractors, and I think when things went south, the school said, well, they're a private company, that's not on our, that's not our obligation. But when the Office for Civil Rights looked at it, they said, if this is happening at your school, this is something that's offered to all students, you're essentially an actor in this. And so we need to make sure that those supports are provided. I didn't say this in my last session, but I did find a lot of resources online about private programs, some which are geared towards helping individuals with disabilities. And it's again, this idea that whatever you provide, we don't want to discriminate, so it's available to students, to all students, even students with disabilities. But there may be sometimes if a family says, we want to access some of these private services too, they're welcome to do so. We just want to kind of make sure there's that balance, that we never give them the impression that we aren't offering something that's available to all students. That said, there are some families I think who have really benefited from accessing private instructors who really specialize in things. So if they want to look for outside supports, that's totally within their purview. So I think kind of connecting to that assessment question, and we talked a little bit about this in the chat in the comment box. The driver education teacher has safety concerns. You're going to review the student's abilities to do some of these different things. And I think you bring a lot of expertise to the table to kind of know if that's an area of concern or not. And that definitely connects to what our Utah code says are requirements for functional ability in driving. And so we do need to have these skill sets and these competencies for students. And again, I think some students can get there with support. Some students come to us and will be okay. There may be times where a student may not be there and has some more significant disabilities where they're not going to be able to adhere to this. And so that may be the thing that limits them from getting that. So you're probably all aware that this is a piece of what needs to happen, the functional ability evaluation medical report. And so this, I know you're not necessarily over this, but this is again, that family engagement piece that I think it's helpful to know different elements of the process and to help parents know this is something that's a requirement and this is how you may go about it to access it, or this is what you're going to need to do as part of this process. And what I was diving into a little bit was kind of this page where we've got these resources that would be helpful to share with parents because students are in occasion going to be evaluated in this area. So I picked learning, memory, and communication disorders because that's kind of our biggest bucket of kiddos with disabilities. And I think you can kind of see the safety assessment level as we kind of go through like more serious components, whether there's going to be medical reports required and whether there are going to be restrictions. And so again, I think this is kind of a key piece of that assessment and evaluation component, as well as are there any services and accommodations that we can provide in our driver education program that would help the student develop skill-wise. And some things are less open to changing for an individual with a disability, but there are a lot of kids who can develop like greater emotional control or greater socialization, better, just in some areas. And so I think it's kind of having an understanding of what we can help them develop versus what might kind of stay the same and relying on medical professionals to help us with that piece. So in preparation for this, I did talk to a special ed teacher who's done a lot with driver education that Audra connected me with, and it was really helpful to hear about her experience. And these were just some ending tips that she shared. One of the things she pointed out is that she sees some families delay participation in driver education because of kind of ideas about the student's competency or just feeling like they're working on all these other things. Let's put that off. And I think from her perspective, it's nice to take advantage of a public offering that's there when they're with us. And so if a student is eligible at the age and time to take it, let's have them take it now. She did say sometimes she runs into questions with parents who want to borrow the school's adapted car, and just making sure we have those clear boundaries that these things are available when the student is doing instruction with us, but it's not something that you can just take. And I think there are more resources online too about adapting personal vehicles, connections that families can make with that, and potentially some resources to help with that. She pointed out something that I hadn't thought a ton about, that she says it's been her experience that students who use wheelchairs are not always used to watching out for others. She says in the school environment, sometimes, they're used to people getting out of their way. And so that's a skill that she's noticed sometimes needs to be developed with them because they're not used to paying attention to who's around. And so again, that piece of explicit instruction and practice is really huge with students who use wheelchairs. But that kind of leads to an example of an accommodation that she says she's used successfully with students, particularly those who are kind of using those adapted vehicles or students who are just slower processors. She's requested double the range time, and she feels like that has been successful in some students building their skills and being able to successfully obtain a driver license. But they had to do that through just that additional practice and instruction. So I wanted to remind you that this is a resource available through Workforce Services, Vocational Rehabilitation in Utah, Utah Assistive Technology Teams. They do free consultations. The folks who work there have worked with folks with a range of serious, significant disabilities to very mild. And so if you're kind of running into a situation where you don't know a ton about what might be possible, reach out to them with your team. And that may be a great resource for you to kind of figure out how to provide some assistive technology to a student. Audra said that this is actually listed on our website, which is awesome, but I didn't see it there. So I'm glad that she did, because that's a great resource, but I found it just kind of through searching the web. But these are a lot of resources just designed to help parents. They have a self-assessment that kind of helps parents go through a lot more skill areas that are necessarily tested by the driver's license division, as well as a lot of short video snippets. And I think that can be really helpful, because for us in an education setting, we have more skills often of teaching kids with disabilities. Parents may not have that skill set as much. And so it's helpful for them to be able to connect to this resource that's like, oh yeah, like this is how I would explicitly teach this, or break this down in steps in a way that I can help my student as we're working toward practice and obtaining a driver license. Just in terms of students who may not be able to go all the way through this process, or who go through it and aren't able to pass the test, I think it's key for teams to continue again to look at how we can help students access and be independent and be in the community. And so I think there are times where this may not be an option. And so instead we make sure that students develop skills and knowledge of how to take public transit. Ride sharing has just exploded, the last 10 years. And so that's definitely an option. And then just carpooling and kind of looking for ways to build, again, access points in the community to get around. So this is my contact information. You can reach me by the phone or email, and I'm happy to answer just any questions, because this is the end of my presentation. So I'm just checking. I don't see anything open. I'd love it if you're participating and you think of tips or information you know of that I didn't share, and you share that with colleagues in the chat box, because I think you all kind of bring experience and things that may not be on my radar.
Thank you, Naté. I don't see that anybody has any more questions. If you guys need any resources or need to get a hold of Naté or myself for any reason, feel free to reach out to our office and ask for her, or email me or her.